Right, so good morning everyone, welcome. So I'm very happy to welcome all the speakers, all the participants, everyone here for this wonderful meeting. And yes, yesterday we had an introduction, an opening for this event, interdisciplinary event, and now we are just about to start with the talks. So I'm Simón Guendelman. I'm just with Laura Kaltwasser. We're going to introduce, to give a little frame for these talks. And so we are the guys who develop this whole idea. And so for today, this is our schedule. We will have a lunch break plus coffee. As you might know, Olaf Eliasson just unfortunately canceled. But we will have put invitation to have a little experience with a questionnaire that will allow us to explore closeness in relationships. So you will then later Nicole will explain what is it about, and then we have a coffee break again, and we have two more talks from Andreas and Jörg Fingerhut and Jesse Prince, and we'll finish at 5:30. All right, so let's talk a little bit. This is probably because two microphones, or yeah. Okay. So when we develop this idea of the bubbles, we are aware that it's a fuzzy and wide concept, but it intends to capture certain phenomena that has been studied from different disciplines. So this is somehow a brainstorm of the different disciplines that are connected to our notion of bubbles. And as you can see, we have from social psychology or psychology, political issues, challenges in our societies, social networks, aesthetics and art, philosophy, and social neurosciences. And all of this, of course, captures a certain part, or in a way they study what we mean by bubbles or identity, social identity. And if we think about the different topics we discuss, we mentioned that the bubbles have borders, right? Demarcations, delimitations, and this can be thought and reflect from different disciplines, of course, social psychology, immigration, political problems, nations, philosophy, of course, the limits of the self. We can as well think about the multiplicity of the manifold dimensions of a bubble in terms of, again, political issues, social networks, neuroscience, thinking, for example, in different multiple ways of conceiving the self, from an embodied self, a narrated self, extended self, or even social roles, different social roles, and so on. And of course, we are talking about the bubbles in terms of extensions, right? How the self can be extended, for example, in social networks, how we develop a self that is online, is virtual, and how this it's related to, again, how we, for example, share emotions in social networks, and this has to do with how we spread out ourselves around, and this has an impact at the social level and at the aesthetic level as well. What do we want is what we are shown, and this what we like has to do with what has been shown the social networks, and this is inputted back again and again. So this is a very general frame. So we also developed this idea of the bubbles related to this work on Peter Sloterdijk, which basically, in a very simple way, thinks that life is a matter of form. So we can think of life as a problem of spheres, of circular scenarios in which the geometry of things is very central to the existence of humans. So he claims that human life is form and structure in space, not really in time. And there are very different spheres which actually constitute our existence. So we have microspheres, starting from the uterus, to all the way into different spheres, into macrospheres like nations or even the planet. And interestingly, for our conception of the bubbles is the coexistence of simultaneous multiple spheres. So we have the self, our own self, yeah? And we have, again, the world as another bubble, a globe, but also we have several and multiple dimensions that are simultaneous, like a foam, right? So it's a nice metaphor for plurality and coexistence of multiple bubbles. So again, coming back to our topics, so it's interesting that if we think theoretically from the biological perspective how life is organized, we can think that life, or even the cell, like a very simple organism, the main matter of it is to keep constantly their own life going on. And the way of doing it is keeping up the borders constantly. So this notion was developed, the idea of autopoiesis basically is that organisms tend to keep constant their borders in order to be able to keep existing, right? So they produce themselves their own metabolic things. In order to be able to exist, they need to, build a membrane or a border. And interestingly, is this border connects to the environment. It's not just like a wall. It's a permeable membrane. And it's interesting to think about this as a metaphor, of course, as well for other systems like social systems. All right, and we also think about the bubble or the self in a multiplicity aspect. And this implies, of course, that within each organism or within each society, we can think about manifold dimensions and perspectives that each of these dimensions can have within a certain bubble. So we can think like a big circle which has like different dimensions within itself, right? And this, of course, is a very obvious metaphor for our society or for even our own self, that we have like different social roles, we have different ways of conceiving the self, and we have even different opinions within our own self. But we can think in a system how much the system support inter-network integration, so how much this whole system can integrate the different aspects of the self, which one call very briefly or integration, how much the system can integrate different aspects. But it's also a super important principle how much segregation the system can support. So how much each of these networks can be different from the rest. And this is also very, very important for organism, but also for the society. And then we are talking about extension. So how much can we outsource the self, right? And so how much we are used right now to digital systems, technology, cell phones, etc., that allow us to, somehow outsource cognitive functions and in that way outsource the self. And how much we count with that. So how much these social networks actually feed us from outside, but how much we actually already have them inside, and how much we count with them in order to manifest the self. So how much these technological extensions are changing the self is an interesting question. And are they changing us from within, but also from outside? And what are the consequences of all these new developments for the society, for example? Right, so this is my last slide, and then we can just take this into the next step. So how much all these bubbles within the bubbles can build a society of bubbles. This can go pretty much to the extreme of having like several systems within systems. And right. Okay, so that's pretty much from my side. Now welcome Laura to give us next introduction. And
okay, wonderful. So after the technical obstacles are overcome, we can start finally. Thank you very much for the introduction, Simón, and welcome from my side as well. I'm briefly going to talk about the broader scope of our research project through which this exhibition and conference became possible. It's through Einstein visiting fellow Vittorio Gallese, and we are researching the topic of social-cultural identity. So what do we actually mean by identity or the self? In philosophy, the question of identity deals with such questions as what makes it true that a person at one time point is the same as later in time? How do we form a coherent story of ourselves that makes us emerge in a form of identity which stays stable over time? In psychology, there has early on been the notion with William James to separate already into different subsystems of the selves. William James was suggesting that we can differentiate between an I self, which he perceived as a global agent, and which is the experiencing subject, therefore a rather subjective notion of the self. But he also said there is a me self, which we can perceive if we take up, for example, a social role as having a certain job. In my case, for example, I'm a scientist, and therefore I have a certain way of viewing the world and of acting in accordance with the institution that I'm working for. So this form is a more objectified self. And it's interesting to perceive this distinction in parallelly with a distinction that has been made up in neuroscience, namely the idea that we should focus less on those complex processes if we consider the self, but that we have to start somewhere, namely at the notion of the minimal self. This is an idea that has been put forward by Thomas Metzinger and also Dan Zahavi, in the tradition of a phenomenological school of thinking, namely that the minimal self pertains to aspects of how we perceive our own body. And there are two concepts that are studied in neuroscience in this domain, namely the concept of body ownership. What makes it true that I can perceive that this is actually my hand right now and that this body belongs to me. And the notion of the sense of agency, referring to the idea that I have control over my actions and I can attribute my actions to myself and not to someone other. And this might seem trivial to all of you sitting here, but there are psychiatric conditions and neurological conditions where the sense of ownership and the sense of agency are disturbed, as for example in patients with schizophrenia who report that they have lost the grip of the world and who sometimes cannot distinguish between who's the owner of their thoughts and their actions. And another notion of the self that is very relevant for us here today is the notion of the social self, that, as it has been put forward by Charles Cooley and George Herbert Mead. in the beginning of the 19th century, namely that the self is a social structure and the self can be seen as a mirror of the society. So this is a notion where the self is to a large extent depending on others, and as we grow up in our family and in our society, by mirroring the behavior of others, our own biography is shaped, and our values and norms and ways of interacting. This is one aspect of the self that we would like to explore more here in the 2 upcoming days, because we observed that across those different disciplines that Simón mentioned, so across the fields of philosophy, psychology and neuroscience and anthropology, we can observe again and again this forming of borders in a way that we tend to delimitate ourselves into different groups. I just realized that what we planned here today with the little bubble, which is something that will be necessary later when the coffee mobile is coming up and you can all drink coffee and juice for free, might be also one way of putting us all into one group and make us behave differently towards each other than if we meet someone who has, for example, a red bubble. There are studies in social psychology that show that a little sign like that can already affect the way we interact with people. Yet we have this historical and cultural determination of our language shaping our thinking, for example, and tradition and religion playing a role. Nevertheless, the identity is somehow not graspable, but has a fuzzy boundary. And now with social media coming up and the possibility to portray ourselves in a way like we would like to be seen by others, we can show pictures that we like ourselves on Facebook, we can tell stories that we like ourselves. The question is how do those different features of the real and the virtual world blend together? And it's interesting, through our research on social media bubbles, I came across a recent tool that you can implement in Facebook, which is namely called Pop Your Bubble. And this was implemented by an American foundation in order to make people go out of their bubble, out of their red Republican or blue Democratic bubble. And the idea is that you can sign up for it and then you get new Facebook friends that have a different language background, they come from a different country and they have a different age. Interestingly, I could not try out this bubble, this Pop Your Bubble tool myself, and I wanted to sign up for it. They told me that either my age or my nationality or my language prevent me from using this tool. So obviously they didn't want to have the German Berlin people in this tool. To finish this small introduction, I would like to pose the question how we can apply the metaphor of a bubble, which is obviously a metaphor to which we owe a lot of our knowledge, but also a lot of misconceptions. That's something that we realized again and again in our work, in our interdisciplinary work between natural scientific scholars and artsy scholars, that there is there are some limits to the metaphor in a way that we cannot apply it to all the different levels of the bubble. To pose some examples of bubbles in our society, we already mentioned Facebook. It's a space where you can seed what you want to find and where you can blend the features of your identity into a coherent matter. But we can also see the formation of bubbles in terms of politics, in terms of external politics. Simón mentioned the concept of borders, and it's something that we can observe in our current situation that, for example, Germany is paying other countries to stop migration, which can be seen as a form of political externalization. Even more worrying is our form of economic externalization, where we can see that mechanisms of cognitive dissonance lead us to keep consuming, even though we know that this is going to be at the cost of others. And we would like to use this stage here to explore a consciousness of how we may be able to pop the bubble. There is a large group of people here in Berlin that are dealing with artificial intelligence and are trying to find ways of popping the bubble through social exchange on media platforms, but I'm not sure if this is the right way, as we recently also just learned that even those algorithms that determine whether you get a loan or a certain insurance or something, even those algorithms are already subject to discrimination. And depending on your name and your background, you might not be able to get a loan from a bank, which is basically a computer that's taking up our way of stereotyping and biasing the social perception. And with this, I would like to open the stage for Vittorio Gallese, who is a professor of biopsychology at the University of Parma and also of experimental aesthetics at the University of London. No? You use this one? Okay,
Yeah, I use this one as well.
Very good. Okay, and it's my great pleasure to introduce you.